The 90s, the most amazing time for comics, right? Well, it was an amazing time, but that was a pretty turbulent decade. I want to describe what it was like with the image revolution in the shop, what that looked like, and how it went down. Hey, everybody, this is Perch. There's this thing about life where we look back on things and we're filled with nostalgia. We're filled with happy thoughts because what happens is our minds remember kind of the happy moments and they remember the really unhappy moments, but without the teeth, without the coldness and the emotion. The minds are weird that way. It kind of softens the blow of the unhappy things. And then most of life is made up of boring things, of the just kind of life plodding along. And when you're in the moment, that often comes across as negative. Have you ever walked through life and you're like, just another day going to work. I hate this job. Ugh, I wish I could get away from it. Sucks. Oh man, I'm losing time every minute of the day. Those thoughts tend to get erased completely over time. So nostalgia is filled with usually pretty good memories and a handful of bad ones. So why did I go through all this? Well, the 90s are ones that are being remembered fondly. And unfortunately, uh, it wasn't all good. I think for many people, there was a lot of new customers that came into comics in the 90s. And you always remember your first time, so to speak. You always remember how you began the journey into comics. And that the you're more forgiving, I would say, of those comics, of that time period, because you were new to it, and so you didn't have the benefit of 10, 20 years of reading comics and reading amazing stories and reading blessed stories. To you, the starting point was always great. It's kind of the same way a lot of people always remember like the first kind of couple movies they've watched as a kid, and then years later they're like, oh, I watched that as a kid, I'll go back and watch that now, and you watch it, you're like, well, this movie's garbage or just boring. you know uh, I have fond memories for a film called Fortress. That's a terrible film. There's nothing good about that film, but circumstances around me have made me view that film fondly. It's just one of those things in life. At any rate, the 90s were a strange time. So, you know, going to kind of one of the first moments, we had the artist revolution and so on. Then we had the six big guys all leave. And then, with the six big guys, a bunch of other big guys. They were just every time a artist got relatively popular, you had the Dale Keown or some of these other people who would kind of come up, Sam Keith, then zoom, they would be rushed over to Image, pretty much lickety split. And it for the store, you have all these brand new comics coming in, and with new customers that are coming in because comics are suddenly kind of cool again. They've got edgy art, and the style is very very stylistic. I think that's one thing the 90s gave us. The 80s, you had really good artists. You had your George Perez, you had your John Byrne. But in the 90s, you had a sudden shift in style. You had the 90s style of art, and you had a bunch of people flip over to it. And from the store's perspective, you have these number one issues coming up. And first, they're selling great. You have Youngblood, it's going to sell wonderful. You have Spawn, again, massive, big time, lots of people buying Spawn. Wildcats, you have that Cyber Force. You've got these Savage Dragon. Savage Dragon sold well, but it was interesting. That was the first comic where it was not at the same level of the others in terms of just kind of hype and excitement and what was going on there. Um, and you have Wetworks and you have other books coming out. Um, and then came the second tier. You had your Brigades and your Death Blow, and you had Max, and you had over the next 2 years or so, you had a big variety of number one issues. But you got a picture from the store's perspective, these boxes coming in, and suddenly there's a lot more boxes coming in because a lot more comics are coming in. And for a comic shop, these comics, the Image comics, were ones that weren't making it out to Safeway or to 7-Eleven. So, I'm trying to remember if they ever. I don't think they ever did. Now I'm questioning. I know they didn't go to like the grocery stores and stuff. I'm trying. I think there were some places, but I don't. Maybe not like Walden Books or B Daltons or these places. I don't think they ever got them either. And I think they're a direct market. And anyway, these comics are coming out, and there's just so many boxes, and you're opening up boxes, and this would be rare at the time, where you'd open up a box and there's nothing in the box but one comic. I mean, picture opening up the box of comics and there's Brigade #1 and nothing else, just this giant 250 comic stack of Brigade. And and with that was a crazy time period. You start to have things. I remember a smaller box, opening it up, and there was just Wizard in there, just Wizard magazine. I mean, picture how insane that those times were. And you had this feeling. And I remember, going down to at the time to Albuquerque, New Mexico, and talking to a store owner, and they're like, they're the same experience. They've got boxes of stuff coming out. I've got boxes of stuff coming out. And the guy's going, this isn't going to last, and it's going to suck when it changes. I only hope that it trickles out, that like slowly people stop buying. Well, that's not what happened. As maybe you all know, it did not go down that way. Certainly, it did. Sorry, it did trickle out for comics like Spawn. Absolutely. Comics like Youngblood, because of the severe delays that would go on in that comic, the picture. Let's see. How do I want to describe this? Picture of every month, 10% fewer buy the comic. Okay, so you have a nice slow curve. That's not unlike how a lot of Marvel books work today, where you have a big #1 issue and then you have cannibalization that opens pretty much immediately. It's usually at a faster pace than 10%. But picture this kind of slow curve of a comic. All right, now picture the comic coming out only 3 times in a year, right? It's so late, you get 3 issues in 1 year instead of 12. But picture that the drop in sales is still happening monthly. So your issue 1 to issue 2 drop is like 4 months worth of drops. Now it's 40%. And your issue 2 to your issue 3 drop is another 4 months. So that's 80% from #1 to #2, or is #1 to #3. Sorry. That's what kind of happened with a lot of the books that were late. They just fell, kind of at the normal pace, but because they were shipping so slow, you could see fan interest, customer interest dropping by 5 to 10% every month. Maybe that's a little bit too fast, but you just saw this drop. Didn't start out right away that way. I mean, these comics came out and people were really happy, and then issue 2 came out a month later, but there were a lot fewer issue 2s because there were just delays, and then the issue 3 more delays, and so you just saw fans get kind of the interest was there, and then it went away. They didn't get hooked. And I think the 90s proved that with customers, you have to be able to hook them by having a steady stream of comics. And if you can get it kind of into their blood, you can get comics as part of their life, then they'll stay with you for a very long time. But if you don't make that connection, if you don't, quote unquote, hook them, then you're in for a pretty long, hard road. Or maybe a better way to put it is a very short road. And definitely hard. Long and hard for the shop. Anyway, so that was the 90s. And so what we watched was, over the course of about 3 years, the kind of image revolution fizzle. And it was funny because people would come to the shop and they would still want to buy Youngblood. They would still want to buy Spawn. They would still want to buy all these comics, but they just the comics weren't there in a lot of cases, or they weren't moving fast enough, and so the interest had dropped and dropped and dropped. And unfortunately, so too did the interest drop in other things. One of the nice parts about kind of how the 90s worked is you had Jim Lee come on the X-Men, and you had a bunch of comics sold, and people are liking the X-Men. Then you have Wildcats, and you have people buying X-Men and Wildcats, both. And as Wildcats, kind of trickled off into nowhere, so too the customers like, yeah, I think I'll stop buying X-Men as well. And so you had a drop there. And so you had just a bunch of customers that didn't really get hooked fleeing the store. You had some stores who overordered, and I guess that's the other part is imagine now you've got a bunch of these comics delayed and the interest is dropped, and then in comes a comic, and it is, in comes 3 months, 4 months late, a comic, you're not going to be selling 250 copies of it now. The interest has dropped, but there you go. So now you're putting it on the shelf. You're like, come on, buy Brigade number 2. You want to. It's right here. Look at the angry faces. They're all extreme. But I'm picking on Brigade a lot. Brigade's the one that stands out in my mind as the comic I was just shafted with of having too many of it. And through all that, you've got variant covers, glow in the dark stuff, and you've got polybagged. I mean, you've just got a zoo of comics. The whole product of a comic had changed a lot. And so, and meanwhile, you've got, for a lot of shops, you've got severe consolidation into Diamond, and you have distributor changes, and you have, for me, Capital City kind of folding and going away, and you got that alteration taking place. And you pretty much knew from day one that Diamond was not going to treat you necessarily the best. So that's fun. You have that going on. And it's just it was a ride that, as you're going up it, 90, 91, 92, 93, 94, I started a little bit too early, but 91 through 94, you've got a thrill ride of a lot of comics being sold, a lot of customers you've never seen before, a lot of excitement, and then you have a lack of capitalization on that excitement with shipping delays and other things. And you have a bunch of bureaucratic nonsense going on with the distributors folding and people consolidating into each other. And then you have kind of the tired 95 through through 2000. And that time period was a time period where a lot of your existing customers were exhausted by the gimmicks and the nonsense and the silliness, and all of that proved to give many people a jumping off point. Maybe they've been collecting all through the 80s, maybe they've really loved comics, and they just jumped off. And unfortunately, a lot of those people were going, I don't really like this art and style change. I don't like this extreme style. I like the classic look of the books. I like the classic makeup of the teams. It's very similar to people who complain today about, hey, you're changing things around. There are a lot of things changed, not for the sake of diversity, but changed for the sake of style in the 90s. And so you had customers from the 80s and the 70s going, hey, those aren't my comics, not my hashtag, not my X-Men. And they just found ways to stop collecting, many of them. And so to get me wrong, I'm not painting it all as doom and gloom. There was a middle period in there or a kind of middle zone where you had people who came into comics and stuck with comics. They got hooked, and the hook went in, and they stayed. And those are the customers that today are largely buying comics. These are, you talk to people more and more who their era began with, X-Men #1 by Jim Lee, or X-Force with Rob Liefeld, or Spider-Man with Todd McFarlane. That's how they grew up. And they went through the Image times, and they view those as kind of not a silly experiment, but a time period where, there was some comics, there was a lot of style, there was a lot of very 90s things people will describe it as, but it has a soft spot in their heart. And they remember it fondly as comic buyers, as comic readers. And so today, the almost BuzzFeed-like style, the BuzzFeed era of comics, does not appeal to them. So they're finding ways to jump off. That cycle continues. The challenge, I think, with comics, to bring it into today's perspective, is at least the 90s did give us some new fans. You had new people who came in. It was an easy entry point because the price wasn't extreme, no pun intended, and they hopped onto comics. Today, you have a lot of interest in comic properties, but they're hopping on to streaming services or the movies or media. They're not necessarily coming into the comics. And so when you look at things like what Jonathan Hickman pulled off with Dawn of X, in terms of you had a lot of kind of old-time customers come back to the table, you had them word of mouth bring new customers to the table. Comics has to create those kinds of moments, a lot more of them, and fast over the next 2 to 3 years, because kind of we're still in this zone of the late 90s right now. The early 2000s brought the Ultimate Universe to the table. That was good. It brought kind of a new revolution to Image of The Walking Dead and some of those books. It brought a couple new things to DC. The New 52 was a thing that happened, but we haven't had the next bump of new comics yet, and we're still in a zone of people leaving comics because new customers who are getting excited about comic properties are getting excited more about the movies and not about the comics. They're expensive. 2 comics is the cost of a movie ticket, and you get these changes are isolating the old time fans. They're not hooking the new fans. Unlike the 90s where you had people come in and say, hey, this extreme style, at least there's some really cool art, I'm interested to see it, let's go. You did have some of that, and today you have largely cheaper art in a lot of cases. No, these guys are probably drawing their hearts out. I feel for them as people, but you have the companies paying, finding cheaper avenues for art and not necessarily doing much for cultivating that next group of customers. They're just not. So it's an interesting time. It's a very curious time for comics right now. There are parallels to the 90s, but not enough of the right ones, if that makes any sense. And certainly, I think people look at the 90s with some nostalgia around these are the comics that got me started. But there was this whole other part to that decade and that era that was pretty ugly. A lot of comic shops overbought and tipped over. A lot of comic shops were filled with massive amounts of back issues that they could not sell. Nobody ever told. I was on a show, I don't know, a while back. And the guy's like, "Oh no, I stole every single one of those Image comics from the '90s." It's like, no, you did not. Sorry, you did not. um, there are good parts. There's good lessons to learn, but there are a lot of issues as well. I don't know. Funny times. Anyway, so there's a little walk down memory lane from my perspective about the '90s and kind of what it brought us, and there we have it. What do you think? Were you around the '90s? How was that era for you? What are the comics? What are the memories you remember, and what got you into comics? Would love to hear your thoughts on the matter. Like, subscribe, click the bell for notification. I notice that a lot of those get people tell me, I don't notice anything, but people tell me that a lot of those get turned off at points by YouTube for no apparent reason. So make sure you're still subscribed and all the rest. Follow me on Twitter at Comic Perch. Give me a look over there and let me know what you'd like me to talk about. Would love to chat about anything you want. Most importantly, thanks for listening.